that, Judge Brown. Welcome, everybody. And I think Rick will elaborate on this when he's able to join. But I think, as you all know, we made our recommendation and presented the recommendation to the recovery czars, both of the recovery czars last Friday. And I think that, as you all know, this is playing itself out, and the city has received the recommendations, and I think that the discussions that need to happen with the mayor and the council are happening. And so I think, as far as our concern is, we don't anticipate that there is any further any further work that we as a task force need to do vis-a-vis a grace period ordinance recommendation to the city.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Stephen, for that. Next on the agenda is that the Harris County this past Tuesday, Commissioners Court made a recommendation to appropriate $750,000 to what we call access to justice for landlords and tenants, and asking that this body make a fuller recommendation on how that money should be allocated. And so let me kind of talk about what access to justice is, and then kind of the next steps moving forward. And so a lot of folks understand, you know, a part of our larger community is legal aid services, right? Particularly those individuals that are low income, having access to you know, having access to an attorney or some representation, because at the end of the day, the evictions is a court proceeding, is a court, you know, is part of the larger legal system. So helping folks navigate that legal system is what the legal aid community has done in the past. And a lot of the time, that legal aid money has only been from the federal and state level. And so this is the first opportunity, quite frankly, that the city and county have been engaged to putting their own money to expand the representation, not only the legal representation for folks, but also the access to information. So oftentimes, when folks come through my court, they base their arguments on logical information, but not necessarily legal information, right? And so making sure folks have the legal information required, be it a representative, or be it a self-help guide, or be it some other form, so they can make the firm decision for when they come to the court. I give you two examples, one of which, a guy that came to my court a few weeks ago did not pay his rent because he thought a moratorium meant he didn't have to pay rent, right? Maybe logical, but not legal. Even on the landlord side, there's a lot of landlords that have miscommunication. One example, I had a woman that was trying to evict someone, and they didn't do their notice to vacate right. And if they don't do the notice to vacate right, then I have to dismiss the case. So again, it's making sure folks have logical and legal information so they can make the best decision possible. So again, the Harris County has put $750,000. The city, I think, is going to match it, and it will be up to this body to make the recommendations to how to allocate those funds, be it through Lone Star Legal Aid. So, and so, I'm sorry, guys. Can everybody hear me now? Okay. And so, we'll be going through the same process that we did a couple of weeks ago. That there will be a smaller body, in hopes that we relation to the county and city by next Wednesday. Okay. All right. All right, Stephen, we can move forward. Was there any other questions? I guess if there's questions in the chat, you know, just feel free to let me know. We can talk about it now, or we can talk about it once we break up in our smaller groups.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you again to everyone for participating this morning, and for the work that you've done to help us thus far. I think it's important to us to acknowledge that we are meeting on July 31st, and tomorrow is August 1st. And we know as a group that the unemployment insurance program, the last payments of those have gone out. And the COVID CARES Act moratoria that was on federally protected properties is over. And I think what catalyzed this group coming together was the notion that we had a current problem, and that problem would likely be significantly worse at the end of July, and we are now at that moment. We are at that moment where likely some tenants still have those that get it had access to unemployment payments, have some of that money that they have been able to make them available for August payment. And as we all know, that there is not currently an agreement by members of Congress as to what to do. And so I just want to note and acknowledge really the magnitude of what it is that we are really on the precipice of doing, and just really underscores the importance of what it is that this group is doing, and just really thank again everyone for the seriousness of their commitment. I want to also just tell you that we really listened carefully to the feedback that we had as a result of that. And so one of the things that I think we want to really try to do is to make sure that the structure of how the task force is going to work over the next 3 months is what we can help clarify for everybody. Having said that, I'll also note that even as our best guesses are, they are our best guesses right now. And given how quickly things are changing, it is highly likely that what we are telling you right now, we think the next 3 months is going to look like, actually is going to change. And it may change as early as next week, because that's how fast stuff is changing. But I think that we really wanted to frame that. So that's kind of the first thing that we are going to do. After Elaine and I complete that, we are going to move into our small group conversations. And we also will have a brief time after the small group presentations when we will ask for a quick report out, because there was an indication that people wanted to know what other small groups were talking about. So we're going to do that on a very expedited basis. Next, Chriselle Pillay, a member of the task force, is going to introduce Luis Guajardo from the Kinder Institute, who's going to be presenting on the state of rental housing. Again, I'll just sort of say that one of the things that we said at the outset is that we recognize that the problem that we were going to be addressing through this task force work was a problem that existed before COVID hit. And that problem was evidenced both by the severity of the shortage of existing rental housing, as well as the high number of evictions that are going on. Last week, Jeff and then also Howard and Donna presented on the evictions itself. And so as we said, we were going to be framing this. Today's big presentation is on the overall state of rental housing there. And that will have some time for quick Q&A. We recognize, of course, that we don't get to every question and comment, so we will encourage you all to continue to use the chat feature, as I know many people do. And we will try with the best efforts that we can to try to get any of the questions answered afterwards. And I'll just say, on an ongoing basis, we're going to keep trying to get better. And so we encourage you to let us know how we can get better and allow us to continue both through the follow-up survey and any emails or direct correspondence to us. Okay, let me now turn our attention to the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint that you have will be sent out afterwards, and so you will get a full copy. In this quick overview, I just want to acknowledge that there's going to be a lot of information that's coming at you. There's a lot in this deck, and we don't expect you to master all of it immediately. Let's go to the first slide, please. So one of the things that we did is we understood as a result of that we need to really have people understand the overall roles and responsibilities and the structure of the task force. And so that's really what we want to try to do in this short presentation this morning. Next slide, please. So we are going to be taking a phased approach. We understand that right now we are in a short-term triage. We need to respond to the crisis. And there's really two different sorts of ways that we can think about this crisis. There's both the immediacy of the housing and eviction crisis that we have, and there's the crisis of external folks that are just really, really wanting to see that something is being done. And those are, of course, related to one another, but they are slightly different from each other. So what we need to do is we are going to, and this really gets to why we both have to be responsive to the kinds of issues that we're seeing policymakers advance, and simultaneously responsive to thinking about how we can solve the immediate problems. But our hope is that as we are responding to the short-term crisis, that we will be building trusting relationships that will allow us to then pivot in the next phase of our work to the kinds of long-term structural change. And I dare say that the example that we did after our first work together, after our first meeting, is exactly the kind of building relationships and trust that is exactly what I think is going to propel us and allow us to establish the foundation. So the fact that tenant and landlord groups came together to develop a consensus recommendation is exactly the kind of trusting relationship that allows us to continue to respond to the current and will position us well for the longer. Next slide, please. And this really, when we are working on something, we're going to try to be thinking about how to identify where are we? Are we working something that's on the short-term crisis, or are we working on something that's really about long-term structural change? And of course, sometimes it's not going to be an either or, they're going to be both and. But even as we are working at something, it's important to understand that we will have two very distinct steps in a process. At the first point, we're talking about a planning and design stage. What would a program or a policy look like? If there is an existing program or a policy, is there a way for us to make recommendations to make it better? And that's what we'll call the planning and design stage. And after we complete the planning and design stage, we will move towards a recommendation. And after that recommendation, if the recommendation is accepted, then there will need to then be an implementation stage. And at that piece of time, our work will begin to think about implementation and collecting the necessary information to be able to make ongoing continuous improvements and evaluation of whether or not the changes that we recommended are actually achieving the intended outcome that we want to see them. Next slide, please. Our role at LISS is to really try to help this task force. That's what it means for us to think about our role. And then we also recognize that each of you as a task force members has an important set of responsibilities. The co-chairs have a certain set of responsibilities, as do the recovery czars. And then most importantly, but not included directly on our task force, or our broad set of stakeholders in the community and ways that we will be engaging with them. In the next slide, we talk about that. Sorry, the next slide is how we will be engaging. So as a group, there are really 4 major ways that we will be engaging. These bi-weekly meetings that we have include all task force members. And there was also active participation in many of the other stakeholders who are interested in watching. And one of the things that we need to talk about is how we can share the work that we're doing externally with others. Second is the work that we will do in between meetings. And there was, we heard feedback, I think, that particularly in the crisis stage, people feel like there is an appetite for people to be working more often than every 2 weeks together. And so our proposal is that we will use the intervening work to try to do some other kinds of work, namely build the knowledge and use space for broader kinds of presentations and community listening sessions that we would propose that would happen in the off week. Third is the kind of work that will happen once we establish the working groups, and the work that will be done in the working groups that will reported back and be brought back to the full task force. And that working group set of work will be done both with task force members, but that's really where we leverage the involvement of others who are not on the task force, but who have the kind of expertise and knowledge that is going to be critical to inform the recommendations we ultimately make, much less implement things. And then finally, we understand that we've got to understand how to do the communication, and the rapidly changing nature of what we're working on just really cries for us to figure out how we're going to communicate both from within the task force, across the various working groups, and to the external stakeholders. Next slide, please. And this one, I am going to turn it over to Elaine, and Elaine will now give an overview of the next 12 weeks worth of work.
Thank you, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Good morning. So as we start to structure our work together, the next 12 weeks will involve 3 distinct types of work. This is evolving, and as we move and as events happen, we will need to be agile and try to influence the local response. So we will be first responding to quick external requests. Second, we will start launching groups to develop creative solutions to immediate problems. And third, we are going to start developing our knowledge base together. In the first bucket, when we are responding to an immediate request, we will need to be agile in responding back to that request and quickly organize a team to develop a response. This will be similar to what we did with the grace period ordinance in bringing several perspectives together and get an agreement between multiple stakeholders. Then the task force will vote on it, and it will become a recommendation that is sent back to the recovery SARS, and after that to city and county leadership. Again, you'll receive these slides to be able to review and provide written feedback to us. In launching a working group, we want to bring both task force members and community stakeholders to develop policy or programmatic solutions that can meet the task force goals of preventing evictions, mitigating the effects of this crisis for both tenant and landlords, and to stabilize households and the house instability cycle. These proposals should be agreed by 2/3 of the task force, and then it will become a recommendation that is sent back to the SARS and city and county leadership. And third, well, we want that every policy or program that will emerge from the working groups, they will need to consider some guiding principles. We are going to send you a full description of these 6 that we're thinking about, and we want your written feedback or any comments that you have for that. We want to make sure that we have a consistent evaluation of all proposals before it comes back to the task force. And third, we want to develop our shared knowledge base to gain a common understanding of the extent of the problem and how it plays for different stakeholders in the journey, to determine where we should intervene in addressing housing instability, and to serve as an information hub to both members of the task force and the community as we gather this information moving forward. Then we have some adjustments and updates from last week, which proves that we need to continue to be agile and flexible to adapt. The grace period ordinance made a recommendation to the city, but we would like now that that group makes a recommendation to the county of what can be done in unincorporated areas. And then, like Judge Brown shared with the task force, within the last week, Harris County Commissioner's Court has requested feedback on access to justice, and we will have a quick response team activated next week. Once this immediate request is addressed, then this will become a working group to flesh out those ideas. And then we are launching a rental assistance working group to develop recommendations on future allocations and what our recommendations for future programs would be. Our first step is launching this work group with a presentation open to all task force members next week, in which we will look at the process and outcomes of previous rental assistance programs and what current programs are underway. Also, we want to let you know that based on the surveys, we have way more volunteers that we can put in every work group. Everyone should not be in every work group. So you're going to hear from us. We want to have diverse representation in each of them. So we'll get back to you next week on that. Also, a few members have not filled the survey, so please prioritize that today. And then finally, now we will move to small group discussions. So we shared a little of what the structure of the next 12 weeks would be. And you're going to be answering these two questions of how do we increase the influence of this group and what can undermine our effectiveness. Claire is going to take us into groups of 6, and we'll come back and report out from those. Thanks. Oh, Steve.
Wait. Sorry. Is Rick on available yet? If so, I think he was going to say something before we break into the small groups, but I'm not sure if he's able to finish his conference call.
I am.
Great. Okay. So Rick, if you want to make your opening remarks before we duck into the small group.
Yeah, sorry about that. So unfortunately, my day job has taken some precedence this morning. Yeah, so I'm sorry I missed the opening call, part of the call, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to, number one, congratulate this group for collaborating and completing the first recommendation, which was the grace period ordinance. And I will tell you that there are plenty of people who didn't believe that we could come together as a group. We have landlords on one side, and tenant advocates and others on the other side, and I will tell you that I found both groups to listen well, to communicate effectively, and to help come together with what we all thought and is a balanced and good ordinance. One of the things that happens that I found over the years, in the 25 years plus that I've worked in this public arena, is that we make recommendations, and then the politicians and the implementers have to figure out from their perspective whether or not they can actually implement them. I think the fact that we have the political side of the equation didn't come out exactly the way we thought. It may in the future, but the bottom line is we as a group came together, and I think that's really important. And I think that the fact that we did is going to position us to have influence in the future. And I know we're talking about how do we increase the influence, and I think at the end of the day, it is about listening to each other and coming up with viable and rational solutions that can be implemented. I think that our work on the grace period ordinance has created that ability. And I know that there are going to be other programs, for example, for resident relief and legal justice and monies that are going to come into those areas. And the city and the county have both said to me personally that they are going to ask us to opine on those and to give them our best recommendations on how they can implement those policies. Now, we're going to make recommendations, and they're going to decide which ones they want to implement. And oftentimes, we just have to be careful that to understand that we're a recommendation-making group and not a group that actually implements. And so I think that's, I just want to say thank you for everyone who was involved in that process. And I think that we all learned a little bit and maybe a lot from each other. And that's all good for our work forward. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I appreciate it. And sorry I was late. You can go forward now if you want to break into groups.
And we're going to, because we're running a little bit early, we're going to add a little bit more time into our small groups since we know we ran out of time. So we're going to try to add 10 to 12 minutes in the small group. As you go into the small groups, remember the purpose of it is really to answer two different questions. How do we increase the influence of our task force once we've voted to make a recommendation? And then the second part is, what are the things that might get in the way and would undermine our effectiveness once we've made a recommendation? So with that, everybody enjoy your time in your small groups, and we'll see you back in the big group in a little bit.
If you have not already and you've been invited to a room, you can go ahead and accept that invitation to join. For those still here in the main room, so the small groups are for the task force members, so you guys have a bit of a break between now until everyone comes back, so you can kind of step away, and we'll be back in about I think about 45 minutes or so. So great, thanks.
Okay, do we have everybody back? Great. So, Claire, I think that you probably maybe can let people know if we can just begin to call on folks to report out from their small groups if we can.
Sure. I believe the person from small group 1 who's doing the report out is Curtis, so I'm unmuting you. If I'm correct on that, just let me know.
Yes, we had a rich conversation and went around with each individual sharing some points, and the following major themes emerged. One, and they're not in any particular order of hierarchy, that we, as a group, the task force needs to have a defined list of action items and goals over a period of time so that we can have some reasonable expectations of what our level of effort is and what's going on and where our priorities we need to be. This in part was tied to a concern about being surprised around issues. That is, the ordinance consensus building process was kind of sudden, and by definition it would need to be, but in the future, to the extent that we can have an agenda that's clear so that people can be prepared. The second point was a need for a good communication strategy and an advocacy strategy. Part of that, because we are an emergent organization, being clear about who we are and what we do, and then on any given strategy, what the key points are and who are our allies in that particular effort. Another point was being able to have negotiations that are confidential. That is, we will break up in subgroups from different points of view, again, using the ordinance as an example, where the landlord and tenant advocacy groups came together and had to do some wrangling to come to a consensus. Keeping that, the confidentiality of the others in the room helps build trust. And this question of building trust is critical. And this is one example of an activity that can either build trust or undermine trust really quickly if you don't handle that well. Another point that was raised was the need to develop adequate strategies to address the task at hand. And I use the example of a fire in the 19th century village, and the initial response is neighbors bringing buckets of water to put the fire out, and they realized that they needed to form a bucket brigade. And that's kind of what we did with the ordinance process. But the real problem was that we needed a pump to really address the fire. So we're at this point where we're organized enough to be a bucket brigade, but not technically skilled enough and organized enough to have a pump to actually address the need to put this particular fire out. The other point was being able to bring others along. And how do we do that? That is, each of us have a constituency. We come to these meetings, and how do we take what we learn here back out to our constituencies, and how do we bring information from our constituencies into this process as a deliberate and conscious effort? How do we acknowledge the participation and the role of the state of Texas in our political strategies, knowing that ultimately a lot of what we would like to see changed is going to be at the state level. Clearly, we are involved at the national level as well through different things, but we'll probably be more politically effective at the state level. And how do we build relationships with organizations and that are either statewide or national that help us be more effective in that arena? And then finally, who are our allies? I think I said that earlier in one context, but in this context, the task force itself needs to be very, very clear about who its allies are and how do we develop that in a very clear way. Okay, that's it. If anybody in the group thinks I missed a major point, maybe now's the time to throw in.
Great, thanks, Curtis. So now I'm going to move to group 3 and have Maria give an update if that is okay. And I'm unmuting you now, so you should be able to unmute yourself from your end. There you go.
Okay, so in our group, we came up with the following issues or strategies. One, we talked about advocacy training for the group, very helpful. We talked about using our personal relationships with city and county officials to increase our influence and also leveraging personal networks. We talked about using data to back our proposals, particularly with by political boundaries. We talked about developing contact strategy for our website and also a social media presence to help amplify our message. And last but not least, we talked about including the voice of actual tenants in to participate. So soliciting their feedback, having them perhaps share their stories and helping to humanize the problem through that process.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna now move to group 4 and have Guadalupe do the update. So you should be able to unmute yourself now. There you go.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I think kind of bouncing off what the last group just shared, really looking at the grace period ordinance as an example, right? The first time we tried to run a test through our system, things that could have been helpful or like public statements, right? Like making it clear what this task force is accomplishing, what we're working on. One, it helps build power, right? Within ourselves, within our community. You know, I think a lot of folks are asking what this task force is up to, right? And so I think a clear and transparent process, even amongst ourselves within the group, right? Like, how do we make decisions to bring something up to a vote? And I know y'all are, you know, that's what we've done today, right? That was what the presentation was earlier today. But also like what happens next, right? Who chooses to report? For example, a recommendation to the mayor, to whoever, and like this reporting back to the greater group, right? And again, just like transparency and even more transparency and access, right, for the community to our meetings, to our group on what we're working on, right? Like, why not have tenants have a space at the table or have access to these conversations? Because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are directly impacted and probably the experts of these issues, right? Let's see. You know, I think really working on a communication strategy, right? I think at the center, it's part of, you know, the greater strategy of any sort of solution that we implement within this group, because then that helps us not only get power as a unit, as a collective voice, but it informs each of us in our networks and our groups to ensure that we're aligning with that, right? To really support it internally as a group, but externally as well on whatever solutions that we come up with as a collaborative. More transparency, right, with the public at large. Things that might undermine, I think we went on a long discussion on just like how politics, right, in the nature of politics externally, right, the decision makers who may choose to push forward a recommendation of this task force, but also the politics within the group as well, right, and how transparency as a solution works with that, and how we educate each other, we identify leverage points that we have to those politicians or to those who make the decisions of implementing whatever recommendation we have. You know, really identifying those champions of the electeds that do support, right? And even the solution was proposed of how we can incorporate, right? Some of I know the task force is already big and there's a lot of voices at the table, but when electeds or people in power are already implementing solutions, right, that it's not done separately from this group. For example, the rental assistance that's going on, I think that was a surprise to some of us in the group. And we want to make sure that this task force isn't, the expertise that exists within this room isn't seen as an afterthought, right? But more of like in the beginning, our perspectives, our expertise is included in whatever solutions our electeds are proposing. It helps build our power as a task force, but also really informs design in the beginning, right? Let's see. There was also, not forgetting the immediacy of the problem, right? Let's not forget why we're here, and how we understand that the current crisis now, it's going to be impacting us later on, right? And so let's not lose fact of the imminent experience that our community members are experiencing, right? If folks are being evicted now, how do we expect that they'll engage in these long-term discussions of solutions later on when they're just trying to survive right now, right? And then there was some discussion on, again, those of us within the group that have ties to the city, right? And how are we ensuring that more of the decision-making voices are here at the table, listening to these discussions that we're having internally. And finally, there was discussion on how we can use our collective voice to call in and call out for federal action, though we know that that is a whole other fight in and of itself, but also shining the impact of federal inaction on our local community, right? How that impact looks like, and then thus giving more power to local electeds to intervene, right, in the areas that our federal systems are not responding. I know that was a very high level. I might have forgotten some things, so do chime in if I missed points.
Thank you. And then for the final group, we're going to have John speak. So let me, you are now, should be ability to unmute yourself. So you can go.
Got it. I got to applaud Guadalupe for her note taking. I did not have that much detail in my notes, so well done there. But our group, we had some good discussion. As far as increasing effectiveness, we had talked about establishing good communication lines between our group and the actual policymakers, making sure that they're informed about what's being discussed and what's being talked about, and making sure they're involved in that process, or at least have an ear here into what we do, what's going on. And then we also talked about when we're as far as increasing effectiveness and not letting anything undermine the process of the group is searching out on an issue like a grace period ordinance or rental assistance or anything, lay out all the aspects of such an ordinance or such a movement, and then figure out where all the different people in the group align on and where there's differences. And let's identify that first, where if we're already aligned on things, man, push that out and hammer that hard. These are things that are usually going to be common sense solutions. And like our rental assistance program was a good example that Claudia brought up, is when the city of Houston did their program, there was some things that people would say that was done really well, and there are some things that all people would say could have been better about that program and its execution. And so let's identify those and be like, hey, we can get easy consensus on this. Let's push forward, this opinion or this model for doing that kind of program in the future. And those little wins will help get momentum going, and we'll feel the power of the little wins and the successes along the way. And so rather than spending too much time and energy hammering out points where maybe there's a harder time getting consensus, figure out where there's already alignment and already agreement, and push those ideas through as quickly as possible to kind of get that ball rolling.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to turn it over to the next part of our agenda to hear the presentation. So I'm going to unmute Chriselle so that she can introduce.
We're in afternoon now. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chriselle Pillay, the director for the Home Coalition, Houston Organizing Movement for Equity. And I was asked today to present, or not to present, but to introduce Luis Guajardo. But before doing so, I wanted to take an opportunity to really encourage us to frame this next part of the presentation differently. We're going to hear some very valuable information, but I really hope that we can listen to this and receive the information through the lens of renters. The lens of renters that are now facing a calamity that many of us will never face and don't have to even really imagine facing ever. I just want you to take a moment to just imagine receiving a notice in the crevice of your door that your days in this place that you call home are numbered. You've already been dealing with a lot of issues, financial issues, health issues, all these things, and now you have this note saying your days are numbered. And if you have never faced this before or known anyone that's faced it before, I will tell you personally that it feels like it's a gut punching moment that's instantly met with a rush of adrenaline, not the good roller coaster kind, and just topped off with a lasting fear. And so I wanted to think about this as we receive the information. And there's a small clip that Elaine's going to play to actually hear from an actual tenant who has been evicted and what their experience is like.
Going to play now.
Yes, go ahead and play now, I'm sorry.
A person by their background, they don't give them a chance. They don't see that can change, that, you know, they can change for the
Daniel Garcia is the sole provider for his family. His wife is in a wheelchair. Their son takes care of her when he's not in school. Mr. Garcia hasn't paid full rent since March, and he could only partially pay April's rent. He says he did everything he could to raise money, including pawn his family's possessions.
A Honda lawnmower that I had purchased to do yards, you know, my son's PlayStation, and my wife's wedding ring and my wedding ring.
Daniel Garcia applied to the COVID Relief Fund in Houston, which provides rent assistance. But the money didn't come through, and his landlord went to court.
They called our name, and the judge says, you owe him $2,400. I have given you 5 days to either vacate the premises or file for an appeal.
Mr. Garcia wanted to do that. When he asked a court clerk about the appeals process, he was told he'd have to pay 1 month's rent in order to file for one. This made Daniel Garcia's effort to find work even more urgent. He's 48 years old, a diabetic, and a stroke survivor. But he had to hit the streets.
I went and stood at the day labor place, you know, trying to see if somebody needed yard work done, you know, a roof cleaned. I was out there every day trying to do something. I even went to the point where I was collecting some aluminum cans, you know, but aluminum, they're only paying 20 cents a pound. You know, we're not able to come up with that money to take it to trial. And now, you know, we're homeless. I can go without, but my wife and my son cannot go without. Honestly, I feel like I failed them.
Last week, Daniel, his wife and son loaded their belongings into a U-Haul and left their home. They stayed in a budget hotel for one night and then had nowhere to go.
Me, my wife, my son, plus our service dog were in the U-Haul for like 3 nights. I let them sleep in the front where the AC was, and actually I lifted up the back of it and I slept in the back.
Daniel Garcia continued to look for work. He used his phone to search online.
I met this gentleman off of Facebook, and he has a little landscaping company. I answered an ad about he needed somebody to help weed and trim bushes.
Daniel Garcia now works for that man and earns $10 an hour.
What I'm doing right now, it may not be much, but hey, it's keeping my family in a hotel. It's about my family having a place to lay their head at the end of the day. And the last couple of days, I've had a little bit to be able to buy bread, ramen noodles, you know, bologna, and you know, stuff like that to feed them with.
Daniel Garcia hopes to eventually make enough money to rent an apartment for his family.
My belief is there's something always better and bigger at the end of the day. You know, God will turn around and bless us.
Daniel Garcia of Houston.
So that's Mr. Garcia's experience. And
We can hear you, Chriselle.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, now can you hear me? Hello? Okay. So what I was saying, this is Mr. Garcia's experience, and there are countless Mr. Garcias across this city. And so as we, as practitioners and experts in the space of housing, I'd really just again urge us to use that frame as we receive information. And a lot of times we tend to be focused on the data, the stats, massaging the numbers and make sure the deals pencil out. And all of that's important, yes. But at the end of it all, these are real people that are dealing with these issues. And to also be clear that this is an issue that was ongoing prior to COVID. And COVID has just further exacerbated an already lingering issue. So I'm sure that the information that Luis will share with us will speak to this. And I hope that it provides a real baseline to begin thinking about nimble and out-of-the-box solutions as we take on these tasks. So without further ado, Mr. Luis Guajardo is an urban and regional planner, professional focused on creating equitable and sustainable communities. He currently leads the policy research team at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, which is a group working to bridge the gap between theory and practice and supporting communities with urban policy knowledge throughout metropolitan Houston and the American Sun Belt. Luis?
Thank you, Chriselle. Can everybody hear me? Great. Okay. And thanks for the warm intro and the especially for humanizing the work that and the reason why we're all here, not only today but as a part of our everyday work and what we do, and reminding us of why it is that we're doing the work that we do. It's always important to never lose sight of the mission at hand. I'm going to go ahead and share a presentation and share some of the major findings of what we have seen in our 2020 State of Housing report. And it's going to be focused mostly on the rental aspect to provide some of the numbers and some of the scale of, like Chriselle said, the many Garcias that are out there, and the problem at hand as well. So let me just give me a second here to set this up. I'm gonna get the screen up, and Elaine, can you confirm, or Claire, can you confirm if the presentation's up? All right, great.
Yes, it is good.
Awesome. And so as I mentioned, just a couple of quick caveats before we start. One on the personal side is I have a toddler that doesn't, a 2-year-old that doesn't understand privacy and space, and he is also able to open Office now at any moment. So if he comes in and things get very loud, I will have to cede the presentation over to Kyle Shelton, who's also on the line, but I don't foresee that happening. I hope not. I'll go ahead and take it. But just FYI. So, and before I get also into some of the findings, just some of the data that we're going to share, it's really focused at the Harris County level as a whole. We include the city of Houston in this, and for us, what we've done in 2020 State of Housing is that we feel that the housing situation in the county cannot be dealt with without looking at both combined. We face the same challenges, and apart from looking at them as separate entities, residents often don't make that connection. And so a lot of the data that you'll see is covering it as a whole. This is also the data that we have in here. It doesn't account for COVID yet. This initiative was started, and thanks to the support of Wells Fargo, we were really looking to do this as it's going to be an annual update on housing indicators and analysis. But I think it's going to really provide a great baseline going forward in 2021 and 2022 once the census figures catch up, and as we begin to integrate more local and granular data sources into our analysis. So I would really encourage you all to stay abreast of our 2020 State of Housing and future iterations of the report. So just generally, some of the big picture findings before I go into the data is, that we know, and a lot of you have seen this both in data and anecdotally, is low-income renters are facing quickly increasing rents across the county, right? And our squeezed into the few areas where affordable rentals still exist. We find that home ownership is very fleeting in the county. It's becoming a thing between 2010 and 2018, which is the span of data that we looked at. And that's really tightening the market significantly as people are less and less accessing home ownership. And so our rental market is really being overwhelmed, and specifically in certain income bands, as we'll see in a little bit. We also know that low-income renters are paying an unsustainable amount for housing, and that are having limited access to the safety net. This is it's being illustrated as well through some recent surveys that the census has done, and we'll share some information about that for Texas that we think applies to the Houston example. And so with these limitations, we find that that were put in place during the pandemic, and a lot of the support that was put in place by the pandemic is really gonna, it's, as you all know, it's creating this cliff, right? And then we know that the biggest impact, we're also feeling it, and we're seeing it in Black and Hispanic renter households specifically, and lower income households as well. And so this is just kind of to lay again the big picture thing here. What you're seeing on the slide right now is median gross rents for both Harris County and the city in this case. In blue is 2010, and in orange is the 2018 figure. And we're seeing that median gross rents are rising at 8% adjusted for inflation, and far outpacing median renter income in that same time span, which is accounting for inflation. It's pretty much stagnant between 2010 and 2018. We've also looked at the National Low Income Housing Coalition's calculations on the amount of money that it would take to afford a fair market two-bedroom apartment in Harris County, and that figure is at $43,000 a year, which is slightly higher than the median household income for a renter household, which is $40,000. And so there's already a slight discrepancy there in that figure. In terms of housing tenure, we've seen in Harris County that we've gone from 42% renter to 58% homeowner. In 2010, we went up to 45 and 55. And in the city of Houston, that's even more pronounced, where we're having a growth in renters that are now, I think, 57% as opposed to 43% homeowners in 2018 for the city. I'll walk you through the graphic here to show, but we're seeing that the affordability gap for renters has tripled between 2011 and 2018. And let me explain the graphic a little bit so that we could kind of get a sense of what's going on. So on the left, you'll see that the median sales price for a home in 2011 is $139,000. The amount of an affordable housing price for a renter could access if they were going to purchase was $104,000, or an affordability gap of just under $35,000 in 2011. In 2018, fast forward to 2018, what we see is on the right is that the median sales price has gone up from $139,000 to $220,000, or a 58% increase in those 7 years. And the amount, or the purchasing power for an affordable housing price for a renter with the median income rising that has occurred is at $126,000. And so then this gap has tripled, and we're seeing that in the economic recovery, renters are really facing a crunch here in terms of prices, and saturating essentially the market as we're seeing more renters staying in rental. What we're seeing right now here in this graphic is that renters across the board from 2010, which is the figure on the top, and 2018, the figure on the bottom, is that on renter households, almost just about a half have been cost burdened or spending more than 30% of their household income on housing. And that figure has stayed relatively constant between the years of 2010 to 2018. Homeowners, on the other hand, have the cost burden has come down slightly, and we theorize that that's has to do with a lot of in the economic recovery and what has transpired since then. Some of those benefits have really improved cost burden for homeowners, but on the renter side, that's not trickling down, right? And so that is a little bit concerning. Just to give you some numbers here, there are about 717,000 renter households in Harris County, and 335,000 were burdened in some way, either paying over 30% or those spending more than 50% of their budget on housing. We're going to look at this a little bit differently too now. So on cost burden, I want to show you some graphics on both what we're seeing by income and by race, and just to kind of paint the picture of where we're at. We're really seeing that the crunch or the cost burden is really elevated for households earning $50,000 a year. And so the figure to be exact is that over 70% of renter households under $50,000 a year are cost burdened in some way. And that's really dramatic, right? When you get under $20,000 a year, you're seeing people spending more than 50%, or they're severely cost burdened in really significant numbers. Now, when we look at cost burden by race, we found that Black and Hispanic renters are just hovering at around the 50% mark in cost burden, or paying more than 30% of their household income on housing. White renters are at 37%, and Asian renters on the far right are over at 32%. So these are numbers specifically to renters, which is much more significant than homeowners, or the average number, right? We looked also at at the supply of affordable units, and this is just the overall number. We have other data available, but the overall, what we're seeing is that a lot of the naturally occurring affordable housing under $800 has significantly declined between 2010 and 2018, and those units that are over $1,000 have doubled from 2010 to 2018, driven by a lot of the newer construction and a lot of the economic incentives and programs that are out there. And so that we're seeing with construction costs and whatnot, we're really seeing a growth in higher end housing, and this loss of affordable rental units, which when you combine with some of the prior slides, it's really painting a picture of kind of the rising demand at the lower income scale, and how both in geographic and income submarkets, we were seeing a tightening of the overall housing situation for those groups, or more competition, right, for lower income housing. In this slide, there's some information about unemployment claims, and there's a lot of overlap in the areas with that have naturally occurring affordable housing or affordable rental stock, with a big increase in unemployment. So areas like Westwood and Gulfton and Alief, Intercontinental, Sharpstown and Manchester, they're all above 11% in UI claims. And these communities we know were already struggling with lower incomes and to be able to support and afford rental, the median rental housing. We've included in here just a few pieces of information from this Census Pulse survey, which was done to look at kind of the impact of the pandemic on residents, and in Texas. And some of the figures that you'll see here are quite alarming, but mostly for renter households with children, we feel are the most exposed. Based on these numbers, you'll find that the fourth bullet, we have that the number, which is about 48% of adult renters with children, or 1.6 million people in Texas, are in households that have either no confidence or slight confidence that they will be able to pay rent in August. And that's a really high and staggering number. The one number here too at the bottom of this that really pops out to me is that we've seen that over 98% of renter households in this survey in Texas reported borrowing from family and friends, using credit cards, or some of the unemployment benefits or the stimulus to pay for needs in the last 7 days, that as recorded by the survey, which is a really staggering number, and one that as these support systems go away, or as these subsidies go away, we're going to be in a really dire situation, as you all have been seeing. So there's a lot more data in the Census Pulse survey that we would really recommend you all to take a look at. I think it could be really helpful to the work that the group is doing. But like I mentioned, I think it just seems like a lot of to be able to avoid eviction, people are going to use all kinds of means, and that's where we really have to be on the lookout to see what other consequences are had, right, when people start running up their credit cards and et cetera, right? For more information, please visit our website. We have the 2020 State of Housing Report up, and if you want to download data at the neighborhood level, we do have that available as well on a number of housing indicators. You can go to datahouston.org for more information and to be able to download that info. The one last piece I really have to plug before we open it up for Q&A is that the Kinder Institute is going to be doing, we're going to be supporting the task force by developing the downstream eviction costs that was developed in a calculator by the University of Arizona. We've already gotten started in collecting a lot of that information, and we'll be reaching out to individuals on this group to make sure that we have all the appropriate local data to be able to support that calculation as well. So yeah, just keep an eye out on that, and we'll open it for questions. Both myself and Kyle Shelton are available to field any questions or concerns.
Great. And as we did it during our last conversation, if people can use the raise your hand feature, which is found at the bottom right of the participants list column, to flag for me that you have a question. And Curtis, I see that you do, so I am unmuting you.
Just a quick question on your data collection for evictions and what data you have available. Are you able to collect data on pending evictions, that is notifications that have been given, or is it just the evictions? And if so, in mapping that, can you do overlays of that and the gap between what people have and their affordability or percentage of their income going to pay housing costs? That is the fragility and the rate, the fragility of a household and the rate of evictions mapped geographically.
Right, that's a really good question. In terms of the mapping component of it, the Eviction Lab has been posting, thanks to Jeff's team, some recent data on evictions where there is a mapping component to it. The interactive one, I don't know if that one is the one that will address that, but there could be some interesting overlays with some of the data that we have as well on renter vulnerability. And we did coordinate very well with Jeff. He's actually the data source that we tapped into in this report for 2020 to be able to have up-to-date data. And thanks to Jeff and his team, I think we have up to April 2020 evictions data, but then of course that's continued on both his website through his team's dashboard and in the Eviction Lab's dashboard as well since then. So yeah, our data cuts off at about April 2020 for evictions, but we are going to continue to secure that information and incorporate it in the 2021 version.
And Curtis, this is Kyle. I'm wondering, so you're suggesting perhaps as well, kind of cross-comparing the location of eviction filings and cost burden and seeing whether or not potentially identifying which neighborhoods with already existing cost burden are also seeing relatively high rates of eviction as we go forward? Is that partly what you're suggesting?
Yeah, you want to determine if there are any disparities in trends. And if so, how do we get ahead of that and begin prioritizing? Because even as we prioritize for those who are at risk that are low income, there's probably going to be another layer of prioritization for geographies where those evictions are even greater. And it may inform evictions that are happening at a corporate level, that is larger landlords, versus evictions that are happening at the smaller owner level, that one can begin to make some inferences as to who's doing the evictions and who needs the support, both on the landlord side and the tenant side. My concern is that, again, how we allocate resources and determine risk as it relates to impacted populations could be refined with this data.
We haven't done that yet, but I definitely think that's a good idea to inform the task force. And I think we can talk with Jeff more about the 2 geography levels of where filings are recorded and how to tie that into the existing challenges and sort of track that over time. I'm sure that's doable. We'll just have to work through it. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thank
Great.
you.
So I have another question from Donna. So Donna, you should be able to unmute yourself now. I'll note that so that we end on time, we're going to make this the last question. But if people have other questions, feel free to pop them into the chat so that you're able to, we can follow up on them afterwards.
So I want to maybe follow up on what Curtis was asking, maybe from a different vantage point. So to the extent that we offer representation to people who meet certain eligibility criteria, and that's tied into the federal poverty guidelines, specifically 200% of federal poverty. And I'm kind of looking at those numbers as we're looking at the Kinder research. It seems that a lot of people who might be getting unemployment benefits would easily fall into federal guidelines. And I wonder if there's any way to also draw in some of the unemployment numbers that we've received, with the understanding that that ends today, and maybe look at number of eviction filings with an overlay of people getting unemployment benefits, so that we have an understanding of where to maybe put some resources in terms of eviction defense efforts.
Great. So go ahead, Kyle.
I was going to say, Kyle, if you wanted to address that one.
I think that's also a great idea.
Really
I've noted both of those as possible ways to cut the data and share with you all. So thank you both for those suggestions. And I would just add to Claire's quick note, Luis and I are both happy to answer more questions about this, and you all are free, LISC team, to share this presentation with the task force, of course, and all the state of housing. The full presentation is available online as well, but this one for today, please share with the whole group.
Great.
I've added my email to the chat in case if anyone wants to follow up with us and with more questions as well.
And we'll include that in the follow-up as well. So, well, thanks everybody for participating. It's obviously a lot for all of us to take in. I will just note, as we are looking at this enormous problem that's ahead of us, I do want to remind us one thing that did pop up in my mind as Luis was talking, which is for those that are in a situation where they own their homes, let's remember that there is a very large subsidy that is given through our tax code to people who are able to deduct their mortgages. So as we think about whether or not we have made public policies in this country to help provide subsidy to people's housing costs, those that own their homes do get such a subsidy. The ones that we're focused on right now are excluded as a matter of course. So again, please give us information about how do we get better. We're going to send you a survey, and please respond to it as quickly as possible. And we take them very seriously, and please make suggestions for how we can get better. It's something we take seriously. Second, while I think a majority of people have indicated that they are interested in being on a work group, not everybody has. I'm not going to shame anybody by naming names here. I will, though, say that an expectation is of the task force members that you will actively participate in one or more of the working groups. So please think about that hard. And just to remind us of the working groups that we've got right now, the one that we have on policy and ordinances is still, I think, active. We need to really turn our attention to what we want to do, if anything, if the city recommendation doesn't move forward. And then we also obviously have an audience for the county that we have, I think, got to think about that's not a part of the city ordinance, even if it were to pass. Second is we have the group that's focused on how to improve and make recommendations on the design of rental assistance. And then third, we have the group that generally is trying to think about this comprehensive access to justice proposal that includes at this point the work that we had identified separately of Judge Brown's eviction prevention pilot. So, so the three active groups that we've got, we really want to encourage people to let us know what you're going to be in, ask you to make sure to fill out the survey. And then last, I asked everybody last time to please reach out and have a Zoom coffee with someone on the task force that you did not already know. And I would please encourage us to continue to do that, as I really think that that is the foundational by which we will build the relationships and the trust to accelerate the work that we're doing together. With that, I will turn it over to Rick and Jeremy to close us out.
Thank you all again. Thank you for the presentations. I want to give a special shout out to Rick, Howard, and the 10 advocates who really formulated the ordinance. Rick really took the ball on this, and quite frankly, got some political heat and was willing to take that heat for recommending the ordinance. So I just want to give a special shout out to you all for that. And quite frankly, that's what we're gearing up for. It is a fight, but I think everybody is welcome to that fight, because a lot of our folks will be suffering if we aren't engaged in that fight. So I appreciate your work. Rick, do you have any comments?
Yeah, so I appreciate everybody's work as well. I do think that we came together as a task force to advise the mayor and city council on the grace period ordinance, and didn't come out the way we wanted it, but you never know. There are lots of interesting twists in the world, and I think that it will help us going forward. I will say, I want you all to pay attention today at 3 o'clock. The mayor is having a press conference, and he's intimated that there are some good things going to happen for our area. So pay attention, and more to come. So thanks a lot, and everyone take care. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everybody.